Delighted to see everybody still with the conference. We had a wonderful time last night, and delighted that all of you are here this morning. We're going to start our program because we have another very full day of very distinguished speakers. And our first one is one of the most active and one of the best known members of the Washington establishment in the United States Senate. Sam Nunn of Georgia serves as chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, which is a very key congressional committee. He's also recognized for his work as the chairman of the Government Affairs Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations, and most recently for his role during the Iran-Contra hearings. Senator Nunn is widely respected for his impressive legislative record, as well as his intelligence and his sense of fairness. Through his position on the Investigation Subcommittee, the senator has long been active in the battle against drug and crime. In 1986, Sam Nunn and Senator Barry Goldwater introduced landmark legislation which has contributed to the reorganization of the Department of Defense. This bill has been influential in determining the shape of our armed forces for the coming decades. When I first came to Congress, which was the same year that Sam Nunn was elected, one of the old-timers in the House of Representatives gave me some advice. He said, around here, knowledge is power. And his point was that those who do their homework more thoroughly and impart the information with fairness and impartiality become power centers in the Congress, even though they may not hold congressional chairmanships, committee chairmanships. Well, in the United States Senate, no one took that advice more to heart and practiced it than Sam Nunn. And it is a marvelous thing that through the halls of the Senate, when Senator Nunn is about to speak, it is amazing how that word spreads around the Senate and people come to listen, because what he has to say is well-informed, judicious, and always fairly given. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce, as our first speaker today, a friend and someone who is constantly mentioned as a Democratic hope to recapture the presidency someday, but regardless of that, will have a major impact on the defense and foreign policy of the United States for years to come, Senator Sam Nunn.
Thank you. Thank you very much, my good friend Jim Jones. First, let me welcome all of you to Washington. And second, Jim, I want to thank you for that introduction. You mentioned the possibility of the presidency. I recall very well when you and I were consulting on that a couple of years ago. I was trying to determine whether anyone beyond my hometown of Perry, Georgia wanted me to run for president, and particularly whether anyone beyond the state of Georgia in the South wanted me to run. So I was looking very closely at the letters that came in, and right toward the crux of my decision-making time, I got a particular letter that was very influential in my decision. The letter said, "Dear Senator Nunn, we've read that you may run for president. This letter is to inform you that my family and I strongly urge you to run. We will vote for you, and we hope that you win. This nation has had all the charisma it can stand." I don't know whether Jim Jones wrote that letter or not, but it did have a real bearing. Jim, I want you to know that I read the announcement that you were going to head up this marvelous organization on Friday the 13th. Many of us expected the market to go down around 500 points. I think it handled your announcement very well. We're very proud of Jim. We've known him a long time. He's an excellent businessman. He's an excellent representative of whatever endeavor he undertakes, and he's been a tremendous force in this town and will continue to be a tremendous force in this important new role. Let me just take a few minutes today to say that If you look at the foreign policy of the United States and our allies, the Western world, since World War II, sometimes you get a different perspective than if you look at it just in the recent period of the last 10 to 15 years. Because by and large, if you look at the sweep of American foreign policy, two things stand out. Number one, it's been largely bipartisan in nature, supported by Democratic and Republican administrations over the last 45 years in its principal thrust. And second, it's worked. If you look back after World War II, what were our goals then? One major goal was to contain the Soviet Union, to make sure that the Soviet Union did not come to dominate Europe or Asia. And we've been largely successful in that endeavor. Another major goal was to protect the access of our ability to trade in the world through the sea lanes and the air lanes, and of course the ability of our allies to trade in the world, to protect world trade. That has been largely successful. Another major goal was to rebuild Europe and rebuild Japan. We've been so successful in that endeavor that we now consider our former adversaries, Germany and Japan, as our leading trade partners, and many times we consider them our leading competitors, and we have an edge on about that trade. But how much better it is to be concerned about matters of trade than to be concerned about matters of war and peace and life and death. So in that perspective, we have been very successful in our foreign policy. Another major goal was to really make the world safe for democracy. That's been a goal going back post-World War II period. But looking at that goal for a long time, we really didn't have much success in terms of the Third World. The Third World looked to the Marxist model for guidance in terms of their direction. And yet in the last 10, 12 years, that has dramatically changed. No longer is the Marxist model even looked to for guidance within the largest communist countries in the world. So you can truthfully say that we now have a move away from Marxism. I think the best expression I've heard is that Marxism and central planning have lost in the world. Democracy and freedom have not yet won. The challenge lies ahead. We've had what Alvin Toffler titled in his book several years ago in Foreign Affairs, Future Shock. We have had changes that no one could possibly have anticipated a few years ago. Even 3 or 4 years ago, who could have imagined that in Poland, the Solidarity group that was trying to flee to prevent going to prison, and some of them in prison for the last several years, would now be in control of the government in Poland? Who could have imagined that in Hungary they would have taken down the fence that separated them from the free world, and that they would have allowed tens of thousands of East Germans to move across that border against the protest of the East German government? Who could have imagined they would have changed their name, and that the Communist Party in Hungary would be moving as fast as possible away from any mention of the word Marxism? Who could have imagined in the Soviet Union you'd have a fellow by the name of Gorbachev, who I think by all accounts of politicians in the world is a political genius. He's a long way from being declared an economic genius at this juncture, but a political genius he is. One member of the Soviet Parliament stood up and said not too many months ago that Gorbachev wore 3 hats. One hat was the head of the party, the head of the Communist Party. Another hat was the head of the government. A third hat was leader of the opposition. All 3 hats. What kind of genius is he? Who could have imagined in the Soviet Union a man named Sakharov, who was in exile in Gorky, would now be in the Supreme Soviet Parliament and would be one of the leaders of the opposition? Who could have imagined, after 14 years in the mutual balance force talks, trying to reduce military forces on both sides in Central Europe, 14 futile years, who could have imagined that the Soviet Union would announce that they were withdrawing 6 tank divisions unilaterally without any quid pro quo? That number being in excess of any proposal for reductions that the West made over those 14 years. Who could have imagined that the foreign minister of the Soviet Union, Mr. Shevardnadze, would stand up a week ago and declare that Afghanistan was not only a violation of Soviet law, but it was a moral violation. He said that in so many words. Who could have imagined that he would, by implication, go forward to say that Soviet law and morality preclude the use of Soviet forces against neighboring countries? That was the underlying implication of what he said, which goes far beyond Afghanistan. Who could have imagined that they would have admitted an ABM, anti-ballistic missile treaty violation, and moved to correct it? Who could have imagined in East Germany you would have tens of thousands of people on the streets protesting and a government changing hands with a new government at least willing to have some element of dialogue so far? And who could have imagined on the Western side that the long-standing dreams of 12 European nations would now be coming into fruition by 1992 in terms of the common market, where we will have no more difference between the German border and the French border than the border between Georgia and Alabama in terms of economics and trade? Who could have imagined that? The changes are profound. I could talk a long time this morning about Western reaction to those changes, or in some cases the lack thereof. Let me try to make it short. I believe that we in the West, NATO and the Western world, must use two words in our reaction. One word, of course, is caution. All of us know there are reasons for caution. The recent events in Tiananmen Square in China teach us that old lesson that we've known a long time, and that is that totalitarian governments, many times in marching backward, can be very brutal and can be very unfeeling. We were surprised by events in China, but we shouldn't have been too surprised, because the course of history tells us that many times reforms move slowly and then all of a sudden go backward. Back in the post-Tsarist days, or really during the period before the Marxist Revolution in Russia, a fellow named Lenin, who later headed the Soviet Union, wrote a book about the reform in the Tsarist Russia. He titled that book "One Step Forward and Two Steps Backward," describing the reform elements under Tsarist Russia. None of us in the West should be surprised if these steps forward, which were so swift and sudden and unanticipated, ended up going backward at some point. In fact, we should visualize that as a likelihood. But the second word, as we are cautious in our approach, the second word that must be a hallmark of our reaction is the word vision. We have to have vision in order to react, and in order for our alliances like NATO not to become increasingly irrelevant. Our publics demand and expect vision. The summit conference back in the spring of this year with the leaders of the Western world, I think, displayed some of that vision, but frankly, events have overrun that result of that summit. We now have events that have moved so rapidly in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe that most of the action that came out of that summit has now become almost moot. We must have a high-level committee with people at the very high levels of every government in the West that will concentrate and be a committee to almost exclusively concentrate on these changes, to advise our leaders collectively and individually as to Western reactions. The events are moving so rapidly that Western governments simply are not reacting with imagination or vision. Two basic questions. Is it in our interest to help these changes? I think the question can be answered in the affirmative on that one, if you have a couple of assumptions, which I do. Number one assumption is that fundamental changes have to be made in the communist governments or they cannot work, and those fundamental changes will be moving towards an incentive system. So that's assumption number one. Assumption number two is that the Soviet Union, if it's going to get its own economy in order, has to dramatically reduce military spending. Based on those two assumptions, and I do have those two assumptions, I think the answer is clearly yes. It is in our interest to see Gorbachev and his reforms, and particularly the reforms in Eastern Europe, succeed. The second basic question is, if it is in our interest for them to succeed, what actions should we take? How should we help? That is a much more difficult question and probably has to be divided into many parts. I'll divide it into two parts today. I believe that our top priority should be to assist Poland and Hungary. Why? Three basic reasons. One reason is that the events that transpire in the next 6 months to a year in Poland and Hungary may very well determine the results in the Soviet Union itself. If Poland and Hungary succeed, the effect in the Soviet Union will be profound, and the opposite is also true. If they fail, those who oppose the Gorbachev reforms will be given a strong playing hand. A second reason is that these two countries appear ready to make structural changes, and those structural changes are necessary if any Western help is to be meaningful and effective. And a third basic reason is that these two countries are small enough so that our assistance can have a short-term impact, and perhaps a long-term too. What then should we do? Well, the first thing we should do is make sure that the program we've already launched at the summit, the food aid program, is untangled from the bureaucratic mess it's in now, and that we truly do deliver food to Poland and Hungary in the short term, that is, before the winter months. It would be inexcusable if a decision that was taken by the top leaders in the West in the spring is not carried out within that calendar year. But that is really problematical as whether it's going to happen unless changes are made. A second suggestion that I have heard, in fact, from the Polish leaders themselves, it makes a lot of sense to me. The suggestion is that we move very rapidly to put in an American bank in Poland. Why an American bank? Because they have in Poland what they call sleeping dollars, meaning dollars that go under the mattress because they don't trust their own banks. The estimate is $3 to $5 billion in dollars, hard currency, could be put in circulation if the people in Poland had confidence that the depository was going to be responsible, and an American bank could do that immediately. A third point would be debt relief. I believe that the coordinated Western debt relief plan needs to put Hungary and Poland at the very top of the list. It doesn't do a whole lot of good to talk about new loans and new help, new grants, even food aid in the longer term unless we do something about debt relief in the short term and the long run. A fourth step would be to make sure that the IMF and the World Bank do what they can do responsibly and prudently to assist these two countries in the near term. And there's some indication that that is beginning to occur. And finally, perhaps the most long-term meaningful step would be know-how experience. An organization like this one, where you have so many people that have business experience both in this country and around the world, could do wonders if it had a coordinating committee appointed to help those in Poland and Hungary through some kind of coordinated system. Any of us dealing with economists know that you get different opinions from different economists. I'm afraid right now we have a flood of Western economists going over in a completely uncoordinated fashion, giving advice all over the lot. I believe that we could help both in Poland, Hungary, and the Soviet Union by having a more coordinated approach. And I would hope, Jim, that you and Arthur and people in this organization that have been so influential can take a lead in that respect. Turning to the second part of the question, what about the Soviet Union itself? That's a much tougher question. It's tougher because the Soviet Union is still the country in the world that can overnight change our way of life and destroy our country. They have that kind of awesome military power. And there's no basic change in their strategic nuclear forces today. There's a lot of talk, but there's no basic change. So they are still a very formidable threat to the United States and to our allies. That makes the matter different. A second difference is that we've had years of suspicion and confrontation, and that makes changes difficult to make. After World War II, though, and I think we ought to put this in perspective, we basically made an offer, and I believe this is the way we ought to view the Gorbachev statements today. We in the West made an offer. We offered to cooperate in the quest for world peace. We offered to extend a hand to those regions of the world that were having confrontation by United Nations action and by cooperation for peace. We offered to work together to try to reduce the level of armaments in the world. Those were offers that we made from the West to the East. Those offers were rejected out of hand by Stalin for years. So that offer was rejected. and yet it was still outstanding, and I think it's outstanding today. And the way I view the Gorbachev statements and the Shevardnadze statements is basically they're saying they now accept our offer in principle, a 40-year offer that's been outstanding. Instead of being defensive and worrying about who's got the advantage in public relations every time a new step is made by Gorbachev or Shevardnadze, we ought to welcome those changes and say, we appreciate you accepting the offer we made you 40 years ago. We should declare, I think, clearly an agreement in principle. That does not mean that it will be easy. It does not mean we have a final contract. It does not mean all the details are there, but we should declare that we agree with you in principle because you have accepted our 40-year-old offer. In terms of specifics, I suggest 3 sets of lights to be guided, for us to be guided by. One would be a red light, a second would be a caution light, a yellow light, and the third would be a green light in terms of our actions. I would say a red light should be given to those actions that would be much more difficult to reverse in the West than in the East. One example of that would be denuclearization of Europe. If we made that move, which Gorbachev has urged, it would be extremely difficult, if not almost politically impossible, to reverse that if the Soviet leadership changes directions, and that's possible. So those actions which are not easily reversible by the West, we should view as not non-starters at the present time. I would say in terms of a yellow light, and these are just examples, there are a whole list of things under each category. A yellow light would be their quest to become members of world organizations. I think we should seriously consider giving them observer status in IMF and World Bank and other international organizations as they move, and they are moving, towards more incentives towards private markets. These ought to be at least declared to be obtainable goals for the Soviet, as a question of timing will depend on their own actions. In terms of the other actions we could take a cautious approach to, the Jackson-Vanik Amendment. The Jackson-Vanik Amendment, in my view, should be waived for a 2-year or 3-year period. We can keep it on the books as we should because they may reverse the immigration practices, but certainly they've done enough now to warrant a waiver on our side. In terms of a green light, I would say several different areas we could give a green light to. One is to try to rethink and perhaps revitalize the United Nations peacekeeping functions, the conflict resolutions capabilities, even the membership of the Security Council, to determine whether we can restructure that organization in a different atmosphere that gives us much more hope for cooperation by the major superpowers. A fundamental change has been made in Soviet attitude. We should test them in the body of world nations, the world of nations and the public opinion of the world. In terms of other areas of cooperation, arms proliferation to the third world certainly should be at the top of any list we have, and particularly the transfer of missile technology. If you transfer missile technology all over this world and you combine it with the ability of third world nations to produce chemical weapons and even some that may produce nuclear weapons, you've got a very, very lethal and potent combination. It's in the interest of the United States and the Soviet Union and our allies to curb that kind of proliferation. Certainly it's in the interest of both superpowers to curb international terrorism, and I believe the Soviets are coming around slowly to that view. And also it's in our interest to work together in matters of narcotics control, and certainly in the area of environment. I don't think there's any clearer example of where we have common interest than in terms of the environment. The Soviet Union has a long way to go. They probably can't help us with technology, but having them willing to take steps now could be very important as a signal to many other countries in the world. And I'm told that their environmental movement in the Soviet Union is very, very strong. So I think we ought to pay careful attention to this. Of course, arms control should be continued. The START talks have a real chance of coming into fruition if we can give the President what he needs in the way of negotiating tools, and our Military Armed Services Conference right now may very well determine whether we have the flexibility to enter into a START agreement in the near future. But that's the subject of another day. The CFE talks, the Conventional Arms Control talks, I am cautiously optimistic about the outcome of those. For the first time in post-World War II history, the Soviets are saying to us, we accept the general principle of equal ceilings on major weapon systems, tanks, artillery tubes, aircraft, and so forth. That is a fundamental breakthrough. I don't think people in this country realize completely the significance of that, because if we can get equal ceilings, then we can take another step down the road. In fact, General Goodpaster testified before our committee this year and called for that step, which is reducing from the equal ceiling level, which would be step one under CFE, to about 50% of the current NATO levels, which would be a dramatic change in the balance in Europe. So all of those hold great promise. I would also say, in terms of know-how, in terms of expert advice, that we also ought to be willing to lend a helping hand to the Soviet Union in giving them advice about how they can move more to an incentive system. In terms of the ability of the Soviets to deal with our private sector, I believe the fundamental goal of our government here should be, in most cases, to get out of the way and let our private sector deal with the Soviet Union. That would have two advantages. One advantage would be that the Soviets would begin to understand something about the principles of enterprise, and the other advantage would be they will have to make fundamental structural changes if our business community is going to invest large amounts of capital there. So I think that would have its own momentum as a way to proceed. I've taken longer than I intended to this morning from these few rough comments. Let me conclude by saying that the question before us now as to how we respond to these future shocks that are occurring in the world, these fundamental changes, is of tremendous importance to the future of our country and the world. I think we should have a declaration of agreement in principle with the contractual details to be filled out. We must nail down this agreement through vigorous and visionary kinds of steps. We must do all we can to ensure that the Soviets live up to this agreement. Certainly there's a risk. People will say, is there a risk? Certainly there's a risk. There's a risk that Gorbachev may fail. There's a risk that Poland may fail. But if we have no vision, failure will become a self-fulfilling prophecy. History will judge us harshly if we do not respond with vision. General George Marshall once said that if man does find the solution to world peace, it will be the most revolutionary development in the history of the world. This is our challenge. This must be our undertaking, an awesome undertaking, but one that is absolutely essential for the future of the world. Thank you.
We have time for a couple of questions, so we can't see you very well. Yes.
Comment on two items I think there might very well be good clues to the Soviet intentions. One, student exchange and entering of their students into our universities for business courses and so forth, because you do not understand the profit motive. And second, the Ukraine. Sense of the Ukraine.
Well, on the first one, I believe one of the best things that we can do is to have their students come over here and take business courses. J.B. Fuqua, who is from my home state, has set up a scholarship program at Duke University for that purpose, to take young, new managers in the Soviet Union and to send them to Duke graduate school. I hope we'll have that sort of spread around in this country, because I think that would be enormously important. I had a long conversation with former Ambassador Brennan in the Soviet Union about a year ago, and one of the things he said with tremendous feeling was that the Soviet business managers simply don't know how to make a contract. That Americans think it's just bureaucratic red tape, and in some cases it is, but a lot of it is lack of confidence in the ability to close a deal after you've been looked on from above and through a chain of bureaucratic controls for years. On the Ukraine, I would say that the unrest there could be the most significant of all. I think Gorbachev has tremendous economic challenges. His ethnic challenges overlap. They're sometimes going to coincide and sometimes they'll be separate. But in the Ukraine, that is the breadbasket of the Soviet Union, and I believe that the one thing that Gorbachev will not tolerate and cannot survive is any talk of separation of some of their major parts of the Soviet Union. I think that is something that they can't tolerate. I frankly think that Jim Baker has handled the Baltic situation rather well in recent days, because we've never acknowledged in any way that the Baltics are a part of the Soviet Union. I think that's the correct policy. I think they were taken in illegally during World War II, but I do believe that he made it clear that we have no interest in violence and in revolution. And I believe that if you think very deeply about it, it's not in our interest for the country that has 10 or 15,000 strategic nuclear weapons to start getting into a chaotic situation with the results being unknown. It's just not in our interest for that to happen. So I think that the Baker line on that is about the right approach.
Would you like to speculate on Mr. Gorbachev's ability to survive?
My assessment of it now is that he has insulated himself with a degree of political genius from a revolution from the top. I don't think that's very likely. It could happen, but I think that it's moving down on the probability scales. The revolution, if it comes, that could cause his demise could be from the bottom, and that would relate to the lack of consumer goods on the shelves. He's got to put something on the shelves so the people in the Soviet Union will believe that there's hope. I don't think he has to solve their problems to stay in power, but I think he has to give them hope. And right now, the shortages are getting worse. So I would see that he has buffered himself from the kind of power struggle that caused Khrushchev's demise, because he has made himself president of the Soviet Union, and he has a much wider base of support out there. He can be taken away as party leader by the Politburo, but he cannot be taken, his title of presidency cannot be taken without a vote of the Supreme Soviet, and that's a much broader base. So I think he's in better shape from the top. I think he's got the real exposure from the bottom based on economic problems and ethnic problems. But my own view is we should proceed as if he's going to be in power, and we should have vision as if he's going to be in power, and we should behave in that respect, but we should be prepared if something else happens. We should be prepared for the two-step backward, because even if he's not in power, we're going to see some backward steps. It's not going to all be smooth sailing. I think it's more likely where hard steps have to be taken that Gorbachev himself will take them and remain in power.
Does that mean that the U.S. has to sustain its existing defense budget?
I didn't understand.
Does that mean the U.S. has to sustain its existing defense budget?
Well, our existing defense budget is not being sustained independent of Gorbachev and the Soviet economy and the Soviet changes because of the fiscal pressures in this country. During the Reagan years, the defense budget went up in 50% in real terms, that is above inflation, in the first 5 years. In the last 4 years, the defense budget, counting this year, will have come down about 14% in real terms. People don't realize that, but that's what's actually happening. So we are on a downward scale on the defense budget. I would be pleased if we could stabilize that budget at the 0% level for the next 2 years. President Bush has projected a 2% growth for the next 2 years. I don't know anyone in this town who believes that's going to happen. I think it's going to be, at best, about a zero growth, and it could be minus, independent of events in the Soviet Union and independent of arms control, but that's because of fiscal pressures. If we get a conventional arms control agreement, a CFE agreement next year, of course, the first thing we'd do is bring home about 35,000 troops. Presumably, they'd be taken out of the force structure. And if you take them out of the force structure, you save some money there. But we have an opportunity, if the CFE talks really conclude successfully next year, to do a lot of serious thinking about not only some reductions, but also about a second phase in the conventional talks, which could involve very substantial reductions. But even absent that, we would be able to begin to have a dialogue with our NATO allies, which I think is about 10 years overdue, of what I call specialization. We're all now trying to play every instrument in the orchestra. Every country is trying to do everything. We need to specialize in NATO. We need to pick out the functions that each country can perform best, and we can all save an enormous amount of money if we do that. So those are all possibilities, but they are about a year down the road. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sam. I think some of you see why I was one of those who was willing to say enough charisma already and try to talk Sam Nunn into being our candidate for president in 1988. Our next speaker is due here very shortly, and we will meet in this room. He's not here yet, and so if you'll just stay tight. He'll be here shortly, and we'll introduce our next speaker, who is also very important because he controls the fate of the securities industry in the Congress. Okay, if I could have your attention and everybody take their seats again, we will resume our program. Our next speaker believes that the founders of this nation intended that Congress should be the strongest branch of the government. Now, not every historian, not every spectator agrees with Congressman John Dingell, but I think everyone would concede that in his own actions, he has certainly demonstrated the force that Congress can exert. As chairman of the powerful House Energy and Commerce Committee, Chairman Dingell has oversight over a broad sector of the economy. I think it's generally recognized that the two most powerful committees in Congress are the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Ways and Means Committee, and clearly they have more effect on commerce and industry and business in the United States than any other two committees. But it goes beyond that with Chairman Dingell's committee. When waste and military procurement came to the fore, Congressman Dingell pressed relentlessly, saving taxpayers billions of dollars. And when a federal agency appeared to be reacting slowly on chemicals in the food supply, Congressman Dingell again moved in, and action followed within hours. He's had a major impact on issues like energy policy, clean air and water, international trade, public health, protection of wildlife. Earlier in his congressional career, he helped push through the St. Lawrence Seaway project, which was very important to his home state of Michigan. In 1955, just 3 years after earning his law degree from Georgetown, Chairman Dingell was elected to the Congress, taking over a seat his father had held since 1932. And so Dingell, father and son, has held that seat since the advent of President Roosevelt. And each election has seen him return to the office by overwhelming margins. One area that comes under Congressman Dingell and the committee's review is the securities industry. So I've had some opportunity to watch him in action. And I can tell you that John Dingell is very knowledgeable. He's a good, solid, tough regulator. He has a strong reputation for integrity. He's vigilant. He's fair. And sometimes that combination can sting. But I think it's the kind of oversight that the people of this country want and deserve. I'm very pleased to present to you, to both our U.S. and our international audience, a person whose experience and insights have a major and vital impact on the issues of our day, Chairman John Dingell. And will you have some time for some questions?
Sure.
He will have time for some questions, so don't be reticent about raising your hand. Congressman Dingell. John.
Jim. Thank you very much, my friend Jim Jones. It is a pleasure to be with you and so many good friends. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to congratulate you publicly, as I so recently had the opportunity to congratulate you privately. I'm also pleased to have the opportunity to congratulate my friends here for having chosen an enormously effective and capable individual, one who is known and respected in Washington to lead and to guide the affairs of the exchange. He will serve you well, and he will serve the country well. And I'm satisfied that we will all be proud of the job that Jim Jones does in his new undertakings. I'm also happy to mention another rather special friend who is known and respected and admired in this room by all I'm sure who are present, and that's Arthur Levitt, who has led the exchange so well for so long, and who I think we would all agree is not only a man of enormous capability, but one of the finest human beings that any of us have had the privilege of knowing. He will be missed, but his shoes will be amply, adequately, and proudly filled by Jim Jones. I will say that I view the fact that Arthur will be having business undertakings here in Washington as being a sign of great good and in the interest of all of us here. You've assembled in Washington at an interesting time. October seems to be a month of interesting happenings. Not only is Halloween one of the days that we celebrate, as a matter of fact, this is Halloween, but also we have had two significant market breaks in very recent periods of time during this month. You can observe that after months of relative calm, securities issues have again been returned to the public consciousness. Friday the 13th, happily this time, was not followed by Black Monday. But I think it is worth recapping the events that led to this year's market break. It can be observed that probably there's very little that I can say that would add to the knowledge of all of you here present with regard to the events of that day, because this area is more your home than it is mine. But nonetheless, it does help to have a perspective on what it is that occurred. As we all know, in mid-September, junk bond prices plunged in reaction to Compo Corporation's growing cash flow problems. Stocks of companies involved in actual or rumored takeovers and leveraged buyouts fell. Junk bond market continued its tearing, which began some 7 months ago, into good credits and bad credits. And it was interesting to note that that market, which had at best limited liquidity, showed absolutely no liquidity on the side of bad credits. Earlier this month, Ramada Incorporated decided to cancel a $400 million offering of junk bonds because of upheaval in the junk bond market. That forced the company to revise its restructuring plan and to delay the sale of its hotel operations. Underwriter Salomon Brothers said that it could not find sufficient buyers for the bonds. In reaction, junk bond prices fell between 0.5 point and 1 point, and long-term Treasury securities ended 0.5 point lower. On October 12, some interesting comments were made. Some interesting comments were made by Mr. Robert M. Steinberg, the head of risk arbitrage at Bear Stearns & Company. They were both important for their truth and prescience, but also as a manifestation of knowledge that existed in the marketplace with regard to certain events. At a private breakfast, he said to a group of money managers that recent action in the junk bond market was telling investors that the sale of assets would no longer support the financing of takeover-related debt payments. On Friday, October 13, the Dow Jones Industrial Average, as we know, plunged 190 points, about 7%, the second largest decline in history. The panic sell-off by large financial institutions followed the announcement that a group trying to acquire UAL Corporation failed to complete financing for the $6.75 billion buyout of the parent United Airlines. Traders began selling UAL stocks, other airline stocks, and other takeover-related stocks and blue-chip issues. Investors fled to quality, buying government bonds, conservative, high-quality corporate bonds, and devices of that kind. Arbitrageurs sold to meet margin calls and to execute their computerized sell programs, and the decline steepened. On Monday, October 16, the market rebounded 88 points and closed up 119 points, the best week in 16 months. Last week, the Dow fell every day for a cumulative loss of 92 points. Only one small options trading firm required a bailout as a result of the market rout on the 13th. This may be one of the few good signs that showed itself on that day. What observations can we make? There are several. First, program trading did not chart the direction of the market, but as it had in earlier times, it exaggerated the decline. Much has been written in the last few days about firms abandoning program trading or about legislative efforts to halt it. Private efforts to limit program trading may be all well and good, They might even help. But I wonder how long those who use program trading will be able to resist the competitive pressures to engage in that activity in the future. So far as legislation is concerned, the Congress, I believe, is faced with a practical difficulty of first how to go about addressing the question. For example, how do we unplug the computers? But also, how do we achieve a consensus? Second, I will tell you that I'm less troubled by program trading than by the impact of futures markets on securities. Legitimate hedging is not a subject of concern to me, but the price discovery aspect of future trading does. Corporations, in my view, are simply not commodities. One must inquire as to whether there is a rational reason for treating companies making tires or airplanes or any other product as equal to pork bellies or soybeans. I have been on record as opposed to stock index futures since their inception in 1982, when I introduced legislation to impose moratorium on these instruments. The third point I would like to make is that there are fundamental problems created by the leveraging of our economy with junk bonds and other instruments of financial engineering. The ability of a company to cannibalize itself to pay off its debt appears to now be more important in the mind of many than its products, the well-being of its employees, and of its shareholders. This does not, however, go into a still more important question, and that is the effect of debt on the entirety of the American economy. Having said all of these things, what can or should be done? On that score, I would have to say that I'm a little like the optimist who walks around with a worried look on his face. People would ask, why are you an optimist or a pessimist? And if you are a pessimist, or rather an optimist, why is it that you're frowning? The answer is that I am not certain that my optimism is justified. In the short term, I intend to do those things which are easily and quickly possible. The first is to process with vigor the market reform bill which Chairman Markey and I have introduced at the request of the SEC. Chairman Markey is now processing that matter with vigor and is looking around for other things that should be included in the legislation that was sent by the SEC. He is looking rather particularly, with my approval, on the question of program trading, the benefits that it confers, and whether or not there is something that can be done with regard to this particular issue. Right now, public confidence in the markets of this country have been seriously eroded. Small investors voted with their feet after Black Monday, and their ballots have not been changed. Sooner or later, the continuing lesson that we have to learn with regard to the securities business is going to have to come to the fore. And that is that the markets don't function as some would have us believe. The making of money in the marketplace depends upon public confidence. If confidence is there, the markets will run on confidence and everybody will make money. I believe that we can look back over the past 2.5 or 3 years to see some thoughts that might be of value. The collapse of October a couple years ago showed us that the markets are generally strong and that they can and they do recover. They show that the warnings which appear on the screens are well worth being heeded by those who are involved in the marketplace. They show that there are abilities to engage in reforms, some of which conferred some advantage upon us in terms of the events which happened this most recent market break. They also show us that probably that market break was not as severe as many who were going through it at the time might have felt, and indeed that the structural soundness of the market was again evident. They do show, however, that some phenomena are going to occur on a repetitive basis, and it may perhaps be good that they should do so, because the market does have to, after all, adjust itself. But those lessons of this most recent market break, I think, should remind us that, first of all, these events are going to occur. Second of all, that while for what is probably a relatively minor adjustment, the things that were done since the earlier collapse have helped. We have no assurances that enough of the recommendations that were made have been properly carried forward, or that there is a full enough awareness of what it is that has to be done with regard to securities issues, the marketplace, to assure that public confidence is retained in the marketplace. After all, it has to be recognized that public confidence is the thing which makes the marketplace work, and that when a market looks like a crapshoot, the little guy is going to more prudently look for better ways to invest his money. And I think that as a matter of philosophical concern, we should recognize that perhaps there is a certain importance to this nation, not only in having confidence in the marketplace, but also in something else, and that is in having active participation by large numbers of people in the marketplace who will essentially have then a stake in America and a reason to believe that this is a country in which they are fairly treated in all matters, including economic activity and the purchase of a share in the basic fiber of this nation's existence. To the extent that I believe we all can, we should recognize that all of us here and many others elsewhere have a duty to restore public confidence in this marketplace, and that in so doing we will be not only assisting our own personal interests, but that we will be doing the public interest and the national interest a significant favor by so doing. Thank you very much for the pleasure of being here this morning. If you have questions, as my friend Jim Jones indicated, I will be happy to try and respond. Jim, you want to? Jim, you want to come up here and try and help me with this part of the program?
He will not take names.
I either answered all the questions or put everybody to sleep. With these lights, it's hard to tell.
It's hard to tell. Here in the back. Could you stand up? We have trouble hearing you.
Right. You mentioned your objections to futures and other products. How does that relate to the fact that other countries are moving into this area? Do you see this as a problem with our markets?
Not only are the lights bad, but the acoustics are terrible. Would you say that? Would you give us that question again?
We got the part about his objections to futures and
To the fact that foreign markets are moving into this area too. Does that make whatever we do less effective or ineffective?
foreign markets are moving into the futures type products. Does that make us more or less effective? How does it affect the United States?
Well, one of the things of which we are now keenly aware is that the United States and our financial markets are no longer insulated, no longer isolated. We are a part of a world market system. And given that, if the world is moving towards futures, it will be necessary, I think, that the United States recognize that and that we move along with the rest of the world. And my personal likes or dislikes for futures will probably not deter that course. And I think that rather than engaging in a philosophic discussion of whether they are good or bad, we then are placed in the position of having to address the question of what it is we should do. Personally, I recognize that probably the fight over futures in the area of securities was lost some years ago. Just like the fight over the existence of cockroaches was lost somewhere back in geological time. But the harsh fact of the matter is that the fact that we have either of these devices present in our world does not necessarily mean that we have to accept them for all purposes and all things, and that we cannot try to rationalize our society to live with them in a way which is most useful from the standpoint of all. There are signs that we are moving in this country towards a better handling of the problem of futures in securities. And there are even signs that the CFTC and the other bodies, such as the Merck, are moving to impose certain disciplines on these particular types of devices. My personal view is that that has not gone to the degree that it should, either as to distance or direction, and that a great deal more has to be done here. There's also some sign that CFTC has become aware that they have a responsibility to participate in something better than the traditional crapshoot which we have seen going on out there in the futures markets. But again, those things tend to address another problem which I did not speak to this morning, and that is the question of how we deal with the overall question of market reform and purchase acquisitions, leverage buyouts, and things of that sort in connection with those matters. That is something, regrettably, which I mentioned in my comments, has carried us to no consensus. I will tell you that we are watching these matters with considerable care in the committee, and it will be my personal expectation that with your help and the help of others, we may perhaps achieve a consensus which will enable us to take the next steps which have to be done in those areas.
Other questions? Yeah.
Sir, aren't you raising the problem of regulation against deregulation, which started with negotiated commission back in 1976? You were mentioning that the people, because of competitiveness, were due back in the stock arbitrage, in the stock index arbitrage business, but I've got the feeling that stock arbitrage business is certainly not a competitive edge to a firm. It's only making money at the detriment of its clients most of the time. But that's another problem. But basically, aren't you posing the problem saying deregulation went much too far, we must regulate again?
Well,
and you find it in the airline industry and other industries also.
I'm not sure I'd say that. Why don't you repeat again?
The question is Chairman Dingell saying that deregulation in the late 70s went too far, and now the Congress has to re-regulate?
Well, I'm not sure that we ever had in this country a massive deregulation of the securities industry. It's my feeling that we had rather a situation where we had a more active disregard of both regulations and statutes by the regulatory bodies, at least at the federal level, referring very specifically to the SEC. We also had a situation where, for example, the CFTC came into existence with a basically weak statute to preside over an industry which had traditionally had a history of limited, if any, regulation either internally or externally, and that the basic structure with regard to regulation, statutory at least, remains intact and unchanged, rather less used. The fight does go on over regulation. I personally view it less as being one over re-regulation, at least in this country, than I do about quality of regulation and the way in which either the self-regulatory bodies will conduct their business or the way in which the regulatory agencies will oversee those self-regulatory organizations. I have the strong feeling that there is another component of this which is perhaps even more important, and that is because of budgetary constraints, the severe inability of agencies like the SEC to in fact regulate the marketplace. And to compete for quality people, to do the things that they have to do, or to essentially just simply process, much less to read and analyze the papers that are filed with them as a part of that regulatory system. One of my very special concerns, and one of the things in which we will be working this year, matter of fact, the process is well along in the House, and I'm hopeful that it will be moving along in the Senate, is essentially to put the SEC, as far as we are able, on a self-financing basis, so that it can then begin to have the people, the regulatory structure, and the other things which it needs to carry out its mission, which in terms of statute at least is unchanged. I would point out to you, just for example, that when the Whoops failure occurred out on the West Coast, the SEC has told me, in response to some rather outraged correspondence, that they did not enter into the questions that were associated with securities laws violations there simply because of budget inadequacies. So I think it's not so much a question of regulation or deregulation as is the quality of regulation and the ability of the agency to carry out its basic responsibility in this country.
Further questions? Right here.
Well, recently we've heard some proposals coming out of Congress relative to putting either limited regulatory or legislative limits on merger activity. Is there any seriousness to this? And if there is, could you comment on it?
Well, the question is there any seriousness to the reports that the Congress is looking at the possibility of doing something about regulating buyouts, mergers, acquisitions, and so forth? The answer to that question is yes. And the seriousness and the correctness of those reports tends to rise and fall according to a number of events. Back in about 4 or 5 years ago, there was a great deal of concern in these matters, which rose substantially as the merger phenomenon went forward. One watershed event occurred in connection with those events, and that was that the Indiana case came forward, which the people in industry came to the conclusion they could get a better deal by going to the states rather than going to the federal government. That represented a remarkable turnaround in viewpoint, and at that point, both the consensus and the support for federal activity in this particular area simply crashed. There are a lot of us like myself and others who feel that something should be done in this area. We confront several problems. One, a lack of consensus. Two, a lack of support. And three, a triggering event which would move that kind of legislation forward. I'm satisfied that all are going to assemble at some point, I hope in the not too distant future. But I can't tell you when that particular convergence of events is going to take place.
Other questions? Right here. Bob?
I'd like to, I represent, or am chairman of a company that has about 7,000 stockholders. And in a survey we made some time ago, 80% of our stockholders indicated they didn't want dividends, but they wanted the money to be kept and compounded. My question is, in getting aside from the current capital gains political issue, that could you have any comment on any program, perhaps in this country comparable to others, in which some program of capital gains consideration that might be more attractive in 4 or 5 years, or a scale basis might encourage savings of our constituency, our stockholder constituency, as a part of an investment program?
The question dealt with getting beyond the current capital gains tax debate. Can you look down the road a few years to look at other possible legislative or tax initiatives that would encourage savings, would encourage reinvestment of dividends, would encourage individual investors to get back into equity ownership? Is that...
The answer to that question is that I don't have a quick answer for you. I happen to think that yours is a very perceptive view, and that of your shareholders. I have to say that I don't have either a good answer or a good comment. My area of expertise is regulatory as opposed to being one which relates to taxes. And we have constantly tried to, inside the Congress in different ways, to address the issue of growth, reinvestment, savings, and that sort of thing. I do not have, I regret to tell you, an answer.
Are there other questions? One more question. Right here.
Just in the yesterday's newspaper, there was a fairly substantial piece of advertising publicity concerning program trading, and it mentioned particularly two items. Rather technical, but one was the margin requirement differential on the New York and American stock exchanges versus the Chicago exchanges. The second one was the so-called uptick rule. Do you have any comments about whether or not these things will be brought together, or will these differences continue to exist?
The question has to do with program trading and two differences. One, the margin requirements on the New York and the Amex versus the Chicago, and the other, the uptick rule. Any comments?
With regard to margins, but not with regard to the other matter. The matter of differences in margins has been a major concern in large part of the federal government, I believe on the part of those who have studied the market. The argument is made, of course, as you know, that the purpose of margins in the two different exchanges, the commodities versus the securities exchanges, are different. I do not buy that particular statement. It is my view that something should be done. At this particular minute, I see nothing happening outside of the Congress or in the regulatory structure. I do see that the time is going to come ultimately when that difference is going to have to be vigorously addressed, and that we are going to have to see to it the quality and the character of the regulatory systems comes closer together, and that devices which encourage differences between the two, which I view as also contributing to volatility, are significantly reduced and abated. And I view this question of margins as being one of the fundamental differences between the two markets, which does contribute to volatility, and which I believe is going to have to be addressed.
John, thank you very much. We appreciate it, and we'll look forward to working with you.
Jim,
thank
good
you.
to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, that concludes the breakfast session. We'll move across the hall, and the rest of the program will be starting in just about 5 minutes.
Be sure to join us at 11:40 p.m. Eastern Time, 8:40 p.m. West Coast Time for more coverage of the American Stock Exchange Annual Conference for International Investors. Coming up next on C-SPAN.